Most of us have gotten some version of a sex talk in life, whether it be from your parents or from school. I know for myself, my parents never talked to me about sex. It was a thing of that is reserved for your future husband, and there is no place for that anywhere else. So the only sort of sex talk I had was at school from like sex education. And those classes were really focused on things like STIs and birth control and basically sort of scaring us into believing that if you have sex without a condom, you are going to have crabs and gonorrhea and chlamydia, and it's going to be terrible, and your coochie might fall off. And so my experience of the sort of sex talk was not a very good one. And I think most people experience the sex talk, but nobody typically gets a sort of pleasure talk. And it turns out that those are two very different things. And today, my guest is Molly Kilby. Molly has a master's in public health from the University of Michigan. She is currently a sexual health educator at the Colorado School of Mines. And before that, she spent years at Johns Hopkins University running pleasure workshops and working alongside the campus sexual violence prevention team. Today, we are going to be talking about pleasure. You guys are going to get the pleasure talk today that you never had. We're going to talk about what it is, how to talk about it, how to ask for it. Molly, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I can't wait to talk about pleasure. So appreciate having this space with you.
So you grew up in rural Michigan and you now work at, I would say, like a fairly conservative engineering school. And essentially somehow your whole career has mostly been about sexual pleasure. How did that happen? How did we get here?
That's a great question. That's also very hard because I feel like it was a very slow moving train. But as you said, I think my first initial interest in sex education overall was my experience in my community, seeing teen pregnancy, seeing the lack of access to sexual and reproductive health services. And then as I went to school and I was interested in it, in grad school, I took a sex therapy class. And this is where I really learned about pleasure. Before that, it was just learning about those basics things you talked about, barrier methods, STIs, contraception. But in the sex therapy class, I learned about pleasure. I learned about sexual dysfunction. I learned about all these different theories and models. And I was like, this, of course, is part of sex education.
Mhm.
And I never really thought about teaching folks this. Of course, it was coming from a therapeutic lens. But to me, as a public health educator, I'm like, this could be in the masses. And so that's really where it started and why I continue to carry it on across my different roles at universities is just knowing that I wanted to go into sex education. And I didn't even realize that that could be a good part of educating folks until I was educated myself.
Even the word sex education, you would assume that it would include things that talk about feeling good because the whole point of sex and physical intimacy is to feel good. But I think the majority of these conversations end up around the health part of it. So, we should just be calling it maybe sexual health classes. So, I do want to get into talking about how we communicate about pleasure. But before we do that, I think we need to back up a little bit. From the conversations that I've had with people, it seems like people are sort of measuring their sexual experiences against a model that was never really accurate to begin with. Can you talk a little bit about this sort of older linear model that most of us refer to when thinking about sex and physical intimacy?
I think a lot of people have exposure to sex and what normal sex is through media, whether that's porn or watching a romance movie or just a random movie with sex in it. And the center focus of a lot of that sex is the male orgasm or just orgasm in general, right? There's no foreplay. It's just going at it very quickly. And so this is kind of in alignment with what we saw with theories. So the first sexual response cycle, so I'm going into this therapeutic lens here, was from the 60s. It was by Masters and Johnsons. And I will say it was very ahead of its time. So very positive. First, folks that researched sexual behaviors in the pleasure realm. And this framework focuses on the idea that there's 4 phases of sex. There's the excitement phase, which is where you're stimulated, you're starting to get that sexual arousal, there's some sexual attention. Then there's a plateau stage where there is that stimulation, but it's just intensified and it just keeps going, right? You're plateaued. Then we peak at that orgasm. So everyone's orgasming. And then
Everyone,
we
right,
have
always.
always, always, just super easy. And then that resolution where you're coming back to that neutral body state. So again, this is like helpful to think about when we're generally thinking about what sex could be, but not necessarily everyone's experience and not necessarily what we see depicted in the media. To think a little bit more about other models that I like to in my sex ed workshops talk about that model and know that a lot of people put that on them, right? But another model I like to bring up is Bassan model of sexual response. I never know how to say her name, Rosemary Bassan. And this is from the early 2000s. And her model is a circle. So the Masters and Johnson's is like a normal distribution curve, but this is a circle. And emotional intimacy is part of it. And then the arousal state is also a part of it in a different way. So the idea is that some people need emotional intimacy to feel arousal or desire. Some people don't experience spontaneous arousal or desire, and they need that response, which I think is really interesting and something we don't talk about.
Do you know if that sort of varies between men and women? If like women typically need more emotional intimacy or if it is more actually similar across the board?
Yeah. So, yes, we typically see within cis women that they are the ones that kind of need that like physical touch to see that physical arousal occur. And in this model, I would say would focus more on that experience with cis women. But I think it's something to definitely consider with other genders, cis men, non binary folks, whether that is related to sexual dysfunction or, again, that like mental state of having some mental barriers to, expectations of sex and people can't get aroused and they're in their head. So I would say this is fully kind of the model was built around cis women, but I think it can be applied to anyone's experiences. So the one thing I do wanna, like, point out about this model, again, yeah, is, like, that idea that a lot of folks need to be physically stimulated to start to see that physical arousal, whatever that looks like for them. And this is a circle, so you can enter at any point. So someone maybe needs emotional intimacy first, or they need that physical touch, and then they have that pleasurable aspect. The other thing that this model does not have is orgasm. It's not even included in the model. So the idea that pleasure can look in a lot of different ways. You can have sexually satisfying experiences, and we don't have to include orgasm. It can be part of it, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in the circle in a straight line in some form.
Thinking about if you were to just take away the concept of, not the concept of the orgasm, but like even including it in this sort of pleasure circle, it almost makes me not uncomfortable, but it's like, well, when am I supposed to know when we're going to stop? Oh, like it makes me just a little bit uneasy.
And that's totally normal. It's the expectation we have in society around what sex is. It's reproduction. Or when we see it very much pleasure focused, it's that orgasm, it's that orgasmic experience. But we also know there's a lot of folks, especially women, who sometimes can't even identify if they've ever had an orgasm before. And that experience is very much individual. And it really shows that we should be listening to our bodies during sex a lot more to know when that endpoint is and talking to our partners during sex to know when are we feeling like it's like we're good, we're done, that experience can be whatever we want to make it. But communication and those internal cues are really key, and that's not always part of what we're thinking about during sex or what we learned to do during sex.
What is a female orgasm?
Yeah, that's a great question. You could try to Google orgasms, just the definition, and you'll find that it is very, very difficult to define. When we're thinking about female orgasm, like there is a bodily response that Master and Johnson's actually noted, and it's our muscles contract in our vagina, our blood pressure rises. Typically, there's sweat involved, so there is that physical response, and like we can note. And it's usually that mental state, that euphoric state that a lot of people are actually thinking of, right? For the female orgasm. We know with people with penises, there is fluids coming out, ejaculation. Typically, there can be ejaculation with the person with the vagina as well. It just may not be as noticeable and a marker. And so, really, it's kind of any like heightened euphoric state, but it's really hard to define. And so what I typically like to ask people when they're like, I don't know if I've had an orgasm. Can you tell me what an orgasm is? I say, what are you looking for in an orgasm? Like, what is different from what you're experiencing now that you think you're looking for? And can you achieve that? Do you think you can achieve it? So again, kind of personalizing that Yes, there is like a physical response that we can achieve necessarily, but ultimately the mental state is what people really care about.
So we've kind of touched on this idea of singular 1D model of arousal, plateau, climax, and done. Is there a better way that we could sort of reframe to think about what's shaping our sexual experiences?
Yeah. So there's one more model, and people who have read Come As You Are, which is a pretty popular sex book in Barnes and Noble, does talk about it. And it's called a dual control model. And that really focuses on context. So, again, when people are struggling to maybe feel pleasure or get aroused, or just stay in the headspace during sex, it's typically context that is creating that issue and not necessarily sexual dysfunction. Of course, that can always be in something that comes up, but not necessarily what everyone's experiencing. And so the dual control model, you can think about it in kind of like the car, like a car. There are accelerators, which are your turn ons. So technically, those are called exciters if you want to actually look up the terminology. And there's brakes, which is your turn offs, and those are called inhibitors. And so this model really has you consider what are your turn ons and turn offs, and you may have a sensitive brake or a really sensitive accelerator. And this really comes into context with maybe your partners if you're feeling like you have mismatched sex drive. And so for turn ons, right, that could be anything that turns you on. And I like to say that because, yes, there's certain things that people like may think of like, oh, a turn on is like being really attracted to my partner's body. But your turn on could be like watching your partner do the dishes, or maybe they're engaging in like one of their hobbies. And you're like, wow, that's so hot. Like they're really passionate. So it could be anything as typical as like their body, the smell of them, the way they're touching you, or it could be more of that like intellectual stimulation in some form. Other things that could be accelerators are hormonal changes. So again, folks that have periods, we do see that your hormones are changing throughout. And so sometimes you may feel like you do have a lot more interest in sex. And sometimes you may have like, I don't even want to think about getting naked right now with my partner. And that's normal. I do want to acknowledge that there's the fertility window, and that's supposedly when people's sex drives are higher, but that may not be true. And the one thing I would want your audience to take away from today is that most things are normal. We just have one specific idea of that in the media and in our culture. And so if they're not experiencing something specific, that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with their body. If they're really concerned, right? You can go to the doctor. But anyways, I digress. The breaks though are something that's really really interesting. So again, that I think like for the students I work with in college, I talk about stress. If you have a deadline, if you have a homework exam, or if you're balancing a lot of things, you have a job, a partner, all these things, that is gonna impact you, regardless of whether or not you have stress management techniques. Okay. If you have a load on you, it's gonna be really hard for your nervous system to chill out and engage in this fun, pleasurable activity. Other things that people may say is like, I just have to have everything just right. Like if something is off in the context, then I can't focus, or I'm hyper focusing on that one thing that's wrong.
I relate to that so much, like thinking about the laundry pile in the corner of my room, or, oh, I'm a little bit chilly, or just like I literally cannot shut my brain off thinking about all of the tasks I have to do. And you feel so bad because your partner can be wonderful, fabulous, doing everything in their power to make you feel good. But you're like, that pile of laundry in the corner, that's all I'm thinking about.
Yes, I think that a lot of people can relate to that. And again, it's sometimes hard to change. It could just be like, dang, I wish I shaved my legs today. And the sensory aspect of my legs rubbing on my partner just feels weird. But you don't want to stop sex and be like, hey, I'm going to go shave my legs now. Like that also feels awkward. So I think that is like a hard one to overcome. But that can be, again, more mindfulness of it doesn't have to be right to be intimate, but it takes a lot of practice. It's just like meditation and mindfulness, right? You have to grow that muscle of acceptance. And if there are things you can control, like it is the pile of laundry every time, like maybe you focus on, hey, I can't have sex until this pile of laundry is gone, or it's not in my view, or we're having sex in a different room. And that's definitely okay to communicate. And so with these breaks and accelerators, sharing that with your partner, especially if you're in a committed relationship, and then also acknowledging if you have a really sensitive break, it could take one thing for you to not want sex if you have extremely sensitive break, and your partner might be extremely sensitive accelerator, right? So that mismatch can feel very confusing and feel like one person is not showing up in the right way and put a lot of shame on them. And so I love to talk about it so that people can talk about it within themselves. Like, hey, it really does take only one thing for me to just be turned off, and help your partner understand that, and then vice versa. Like, hey, I'm not sexualizing you. I just like truly love you and you're beautiful, or, I love the things you do for me. And that's such a turn on. I'm just instantly ready and to have sex with you. And so, like, having that communication and conversation is really important. And then I know I shared this with you, but I'll tell the audience that Come As You Are. So, Emily Nagoski, who's the author, if you go to her website, there is some resources. So, you can take the sexual temperament questionnaire and you can figure out if you do have a high sensitive break, low sensitive accelerator, etc. And you can do that with your partner and say, like, hey, look, I'm telling you, like, especially because people feel very invalidated in the experience. Like, this questionnaire is telling me I have like a sensitive accelerator. Like, I'm not trying to sexualize you in our relationship. So again, just more information, more tools to use to help you feel validated in your body and your experience.
I love that. I've found, like, at least for myself, that no matter how many times I know that my partner has no issues with like body hair whatsoever. But I know for myself that I have to like make it known for some reason that like, hey, I just want you to know, I know that my legs aren't shaved. I'll say sorry. And he's always like, no, no, like you're fine. I don't care. Like, give me a forest. Let me like, let me crawl through that shit. But for some reason, just being able to voice it out loud helps me like, just want you to know that I know. And then we can move through the situation. So I feel like there's so much power, and it can help you kind of release that if you just have the conversation. So, like in this scenario, going through that list, learning your accelerators, learning your brakes, and then also I'm assuming that they can kind of change probably too, right? Would that be a conversation that you would want to go through that questionnaire again, or is it more something where typically people's brakes and accelerators remain pretty consistent?
I would say overall they can change. And typically, this is where people start to feel like they have unsatisfied sex lives in a relationship that they've been in for 10 years. Cause they're like, but you had such a high sex drive when I met you. Like, you wanted to have sex all the time, or we were
When we were
more matched.
16.
Yeah, we were 16, like, that's when it was the highest, so yeah, like, I think it's important, again, every couple years. Also, I think with sensitivity, that usually stays pretty much the same. I would say if there are maybe more extreme events, whether that is traumatic, so sexual trauma is an example of when you may have a more sensitive break or a more sensitive accelerator, or again, maybe you're like, just had a baby, you just bought a house. Like, that's an extreme event that could change things. But typically, you don't see the sensitivity change as often as maybe just your turn ons and turn offs and like what those things are. Those could accumulate in different ways rather than just like the sensitivity level.
Is this sort of idea of accelerators and brakes, is it different for someone who has experienced sexual trauma, or do they kind of fall into the same bucket?
I think they could use the framework, and probably would again like be really helpful to understand their bodies, especially if they see a change in their sex drive. It could be really helpful to understand that. I think one thing to note is just that we know that typically survivors of sexual violence could be on one of two ends. Like, they could have a high sensitive break, right? They went through a trauma response, their fight, flight, or freeze. If their nervous system has not been regulated and they haven't processed that trauma, putting your body in a very similar situation, even though it's safe and consensual, can really, again, freeze your body up, and that's your turn off, right? And you're sensitive. On the opposite end, we also know survivors of sexual violence could increase high risk sexy behaviors. And so they could be on the opposite end. And I think that's even like the one that people don't talk about more is like some people end up sexualizing themselves a lot and they start to have more sex. And that can be really weird or difficult for people around them to understand. But again, it's a response to trauma and that kind of shift in their body and what their body needs and listening to their body. So, yeah, I definitely think that lens, you can see that they're probably going to be on more of those extreme ends, but there could be people in the middle, and the framework will be helpful for anyone.
Sometimes, and honestly, I'm guilty of this, of like, oh, well, you need to be more careful with someone who has experienced sexual violence, which on one end of the spectrum, yes. But also, like, shouldn't you be treating everybody with the same respect and care and checking in, regardless of whether they have experienced sexual violence or not?
Yeah.
Probably. Yeah. I sort of had a question about this idea of like pumping the brakes and the accelerators. I know for myself, I've had times where I'm like sitting there and I'm thinking, I really want to do this. I would love to be intimate with my partner tonight, all of that. But then for some reason, like the mechanics, they're not working. I'm not, the body is not bodying. And it kind of becomes a break in a way because it's like, oh, I can't, nothing is working. So, what happens if there's this disconnect between the intellectual side of this and that being an accelerator, but your body sort of pumping the brakes?
And again, super normal, like regardless of whether you've experienced sexual violence. I think looking through the lens of like supporting someone that has sexual trauma can be really helpful though. And I think so anyone who's experiencing that, regardless of being a survivor or not, should take this advice. So my thoughts are that you got to take sex out of the picture. If you're going through a rabbit hole of like, oh, I want this really bad, my body's not working the way I want it to, your body's just going to continue to resist you. One thing that I continue to emphasize and why we see that trauma processing is really important is because your nervous system is a huge part of your sexual experience. There's a lot of nerves in your genitalia, regardless of what kind of genitals you have. And so those remember your events, and they also remember when you're not actually listening to it. So even if it's just like, I want to have sex, but like nothing's working, I'm using lube, but it's just like my body's resisting it. And you're continuing to try whatever that is, penetrative, oral sex, etc. Your body's saying, hey, you're not listening to me. I don't like you. And so like that's something to consider. And so removing sex out of the picture and say, like, I want to be intimate with my partner right now, or I really want to give myself pleasure outside of the focus of masturbation and focus on that touch. So, one of the things, if anyone has ever gone to a sex therapist or a therapist that has any kind of sexual trauma education, is sensate focus. Have you heard of sensate focus?
I don't think I have, and
Okay.
I'm excited
Okay.
for you to tell me about it.
So it's a therapist tool, typically given to survivors of sexual violence when they're struggling to experience like that sexual pleasure. And the idea is like we're gonna like hang out with my partner or partners, and we're gonna experience touch in a pleasurable way, but the goal is not sex. There is, like, a way to lead up to penetrative or oral sex or, kissing one's breast or whatever, but the goal is just exploring one's body. So this is another resource I gave you.
And I'll like link all these resources down below in the show notes for you guys too. So like Molly's given us a nice toolbox of things for you guys to check out. So that'll all be linked in the show notes.
Yes, and this one's really important because it is kind of a step-by-step process. Read it over with your partner, say like, "Hey, I wanna try this," and try it outside of the context of like, the one time or the few times you're like struggling, so you have the skill to like remember how to do it without looking at a piece of paper. But it goes from, "Let's just touch your shoulders and like just gently drift my fingers across your skin," to like kissing, but the whole agreement is we're not gonna have sex. And that can really help reduce the pressure for the person that's maybe struggling with their body and the sexual response. Also, can help the partner who is trying their best and they also feel like they're not doing anything right. Or if they're a partner of someone who has survived sexual violence, they could feel like, well, I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to do this. So the pressure is gone between you two and curiosity comes back. And I think curiosity is really, really important in sex and pleasure and overall, but something to keep in mind. And that could include like temperature play, textures, sounds. And it's more about that body experience and that intimacy. And then that tells your body, hey, this is okay. This touch is okay. Even when I'm naked, even when I'm on the bed, and the context may be very similar to sex, but you're telling your nervous system, we can try this out. And maybe it'll lead to sex one day, but right now it doesn't. And so when you get into those contexts, one, you could just pull that toolbox back out and say, let's back it up. Let's touch each other. Or it will also just help retrain your nervous system to say, like, this is okay. This is all right. So sensate focus is one that I really like. The other one I would say that isn't specific to sexual violence, but can be also helpful is more around consent and touch, and that's body mapping. Have you heard of body mapping?
Yes,
Okay.
briefly, but I don't want to be the one to explain it because you're the
Like, go
professional
ahead.
here.
So body mapping is a little bit more simpler, so you don't really have a lot of instructions. You can draw like an outline of a body on a piece of paper, and you can use colors or just annotate it with different symbols. But the idea is that there are areas on your body you don't want to be touched. And we're thinking about this in a sexual context, but you could do it if you want to do a massage with your partner, whatever it may be. So you could color that red, right? Like maybe I don't want my inner thigh touched. So that's red. And it could like get deeper. It could just be like not touch at all, or I never want it touched in this way. Maybe it's like I don't ever want my inner thigh bitten. And then yellow is kind of that in between. I typically like being touched in this area. And again, maybe it's a certain type of touch or maybe is context dependent. Like I like anal sex, but I definitely need to have not stress or I need to, have pooped today. Like I need to feel confident in my body. And so there's that context piece. And then green is like typically I always love my body being touched in this way in the context of sex, in the context to consent. And so this could be a really good tool, again, to tell your partner, this is what I really like. This is what I'm willing to explore. Please don't touch me here. And so, again, having those guardrails can be really helpful for the mental state of like, I know my partner is not going to touch the areas that are going to trigger me or to completely take me out of the moment because I just don't think it's sexy. Like, don't touch my feet, like my feet are sweaty during sex, whatever it may be. And so, again, just using tools to communicate with your partner so you can release that stress that you may be holding or that fear of whatever may happen that is maybe negative in some form.
I love this. I think that we have this sort of veil that gets put over sex where it's like, no, you don't get to figure it out until you have enough to where you like figure out your partner and like you just like somehow magically understand it one day. When that's just not how we communicate about literally anything else on the planet. At all. And so I love this idea of sort of giving someone a map of these are the things I like. This is what I don't like. This is how we're going to end up being more successful. Because once again, the whole point of all of this is for both parties to enjoy it, right? Like that's the point of aside from like reproductive sexual intercourse, everything else about it is supposed to be feeling good and connection. And so, like, why wouldn't you want to do everything in your power to understand all of that stuff about your partner to be able to get to a place of pleasure?
Absolutely.
Which brings me to my next question. I really want to talk about how do we start having these conversations around pleasure and what we want. Obviously, you've been in this space for a long time. You're very comfortable talking about it. I think I'm fairly comfortable talking about it, but I would probably argue that most people are very uncomfortable thinking and talking about sex out loud, especially with another person. So, how do we sort of work through that? Like, how do we get to these conversations around pleasure so that everybody can start to feel good and experience pleasure?
You are right. I come into these workshops, I'm ready to say penis, I'm ready to talk about anal sex, and I'm talking to these 18-year-olds who, especially again, now where I work, who may have never had a really good sex education. So I came from Michigan where we had a little bit higher bar on sex education, but the folks I work with, some of them have minimal or nothing. And so just the word penis is like, oh my gosh, I'm going to laugh here with my buddies about this. Especially when it's like, oh, someone of a different gender talking about maybe the genitals that I have. And so I think one, we all can do better work in like talking to our friends about sex. I think that in any group, it can be really, really difficult to break the ice, but it doesn't have to be like, I'm going to tell you about my sex life. But saying, hey, I just learned about this cool resource, just want to share it with you. Or again, if you all are married or all in long term relationships, you can say, like, start up a conversation. How has your sex life changed? So I think we could break the ice. It will be awkward. I will say that any way that you're going to talk about pleasure for the first time or sex, just know that it's going to be awkward and that's okay because we want to start to normalize this and someone
Right.
has to do it. And so outside of sex educators, outside of people like you who are doing podcasts and bringing folks on, we need the lay people to feel comfortable. And even if it's just reading romance books that have these words in them, maybe read them out loud to yourself. I always like to read some words out loud to my husband when I'm like, "This is a funny way to say vagina." But, just like saying like this is how some people are comfortable saying vagina, and it's not saying vagina. So I think it's really important, one, to just like start where you feel comfortable, which is typically by yourself. Maybe again verbalizing some of these words or being able to talk to your friends, or maybe you feel more comfortable talking to your gynecologist, and just saying like, "Hey, like, is this normal?" Like asking one question about sex, even if you don't really care to know the answer, but you just want to get practice talking to someone. And like your gynecologist of all people will be completely fine talking to you about
Right.
sex. So that's where I would start. But I do have a resource that I did not make. I will say that, but I got it from a colleague from UC Davis, who also works in sex education, called the Pleasure Profile. And this is a really great tool to get you acclimated to the idea of pleasure. So I hand this handout out at every single workshop I ever do, even if I'm not talking about pleasure. And it is just like an STIs education. I want to put this out there. And so I'm just gonna imagine people from your audience probably doing this similar reaction, but the look on their faces is usually pretty of discomfort, but in like a funny way. A lot of people laugh when they see these words, and it's just like, it's okay. That reaction is something to get used to. You need to be comfortable thinking about your own pleasure before you can have sex. But people, of course, have sex before. Um, Maybe thinking about their pleasure. So, this handout has you kind of think about what influences your sexuality. So, again, that could be media, that could be different behaviors, it could be your community, it could be your religion. It has you think about, when do you feel sexiest? When do you feel sexy? So, it has you kind of fill in the blank certain questions there. But the area that people are like, oh my gosh, is the sexual activities that are pleasurable to me section. And this is not comprehensive list, but a list of different things that could be pleasurable. So watching porn, anal play, 69, being on top, being on bottom, rubbing genitals together. So we have this list, and it's supposed to be kind of different behaviors across the spectrum for people to get curious about. And so I always tell people, take a look at this and see what sparks interest. You may have never had sex before, right? But you can look at this and be like, this sounds interesting. Or you'd be like, absolutely not.
Right.
And that's fine. Like, you have that gut reaction. You're like, right now, I'm not interested in sex toys, and that's okay. So that kind of initial response can be really helpful in guiding what would you be willing to explore, or what do you know really gets you off already? Like a reminder of like, yeah, I really love doggy style. That gets me off. Absolutely circling that. So it increases one's curiosity and then makes them hopefully explore different things. So if you like anal play, maybe at some point you'll try anal sex. If you do like sex toys, maybe you only have one sex toy, maybe you'll explore different ones. So it starts there. And then there's a chart at the very bottom, which I think, again, kind of goes back to sensate focus and body mapping, but thinking about specific actions that you like to receive. So, again, maybe you like a shoulder massage during foreplay, like your partner's kissing your neck, they're massaging your shoulders, and you have a certain type of touch you like that will help kind of increase that like sexual response. Maybe it's a deeper touch or a lighter touch. And so you can write these different behaviors on this graph here based off of the pressure and the speed. So it's definitely something to have folks fill out by themselves. Just be curious, and they can try some things when they're masturbating with by themselves. Other ways I tell people is like, fill it out by yourself and then give it to your partner. If you are super awkward and like, I don't even want to be in the room when they read it, that's fine. You can give it to them. It's a starting point. Or you can fill out together, have your own handouts, and then switch and then create a conversation about it. So, whatever level
Mhm.
you feel comfortable with. But even again, like, of course, I want people talking about their pleasure, but if they're not willing to communicate it, having a handout to show is a great, like, nonverbal way to kind of talk about pleasure in some form. So, that is like the one side. The flip side is talking more about sexual communication. And as you said, like, communication is such a key part of pleasure. And so we want to make sure that that is part of this conversation or consideration. And that is the framework of before, during, and after. So when do we actually talk about pleasure? That's a big question I always get. The idea here is that you're talking about before, you're talking about during, you're talking about after. Before being
We're
specific.
communicating.
Yeah, we're
Like, I feel like
communicating.
yeah, in the movies, I just always think about the scenes where they, like, come home and they're, like, slamming across the walls, clothes are being ripped off, and they're just going, and then it you kinda cut to them just falling next to each other and being like, "Wow, that was amazing," and there's
Nothing.
not a single moment of communication. Not to mention, where is the semen? Like, literally, where is that going? Is it in them? I never saw them put a condom on it, so it's not in a condom. No,
That's a really good point. I've never
that's
thought of
never
that
talked about.
that before.
Like, there's cum somewhere. No one ever shows where you're supposed to put it or what you're supposed to do. But
Yeah,
sorry,
actually,
I
I've
digress.
never thought about that, but I probably will have your voice in my head every time I watch. So I think about other things. I'm like, there's no condom, like, there's no talk about STIs. So yes, yes, that is again what a lot of people are thinking about when they're having sex. Maybe they're a little bit more inexperienced and they're like, this is what it's going to be like. There's no communication unless it's dirty talk. That's like the hard part is getting started. So again, this will be awkward, but the before part, highly emphasize don't do it like again I think a lot of people don't experience spontaneous desire or arousal or both partners do a lot of times it's like maybe you're watching movies and then you're maybe kissing or touching each other and you're like all of a sudden like yeah let's have sex, let's go in the bedroom, right? So like there is that kind of in between, but I always say like don't ask this in the heat of the moment and have conversations. This is where this is more of like recommendations for folks in with a consistent partner or partners. And so the idea here is like, let's talk about like in this context, what kind of positions do I want to do with you? What kind of positions do you want to do? What kind of lube do we want to use? Like if we're using condoms, is there a certain type that you want to use? What other context? Like this is where you can bring in like, okay, I got to get the dishes done, or like, I'm coming over tonight, so let's make sure our spaces are clean, etc. And so there's that before part. Also, during the before part, you should talk about aftercare, which I know may seem like, why don't we wait till after? But aftercare is something that we take from the BDSM community, where it's the concept of like, let's make sure everyone has their needs fulfilled after sex. So, whether that is a person with a vulva who gets UTIs frequently after sex and they instantly have to run to the bathroom and go pee. One, tell your partner that so they're like not thinking, wow, I suck in bed. Like, what was that?
It just took
Or
off. Got
yeah,
a blast.
yeah. I even think about like the Sex and the City episode, which I used to watch a long time ago, but there was someone's partner took a shower every time after sex, and there were some other things involved in that, but like I think it was Miranda. And Miranda was like, "What the heck? I've never known a partner to have like am I dirty?" And so again, like telling your partner, "This is what I need," whether that is cuddles, whether that is I need to wash off the cum before I cuddle you, or I don't want to cuddle. Like I want to get dressed and put on clothes and we can go back to watching the movie and talk about it and do our other after stuff. So I think that's really important to talk about beforehand so no one's surprised or feels like something went wrong and I don't know what it is. During sex, of course, is just that ongoing like consent. Do you like this? Hey, we talked about doing, doggy style. Do you still want to do it? And getting that verbal or nonverbal consent. And then after, I like to say is like talk about the sex. Was it good? Was it bad? Like maybe
Performance
don't say
review.
like, oh, this was really bad sex, unless you both agree, like, that was a weird one tonight. But like saying like, hey, that was really hot when you did XYZ, or like, next time I think I'd be interested in you playing around with this kind of formation for fingering. And it doesn't have to be like, I really hated how you fingered me. There could be different ways, but that kind of conversation makes it easier. So when you have sex again, maybe you don't have to ask in the heat of the moment to change things up in some form. So those are things. Of course, other things you need to talk about are SDIs, barrier methods, and how you're going to consent.
I know we're still talking about specifically with consistent partners, but I do have to say that, gosh, also I always am like, Lord Jesus, like please help my mother and my stepfather to never listen to episodes like this. Um, but in college, whenever I would be hooking up with people, which like I said, we'll get to that in a second, I would always talk to them about, so what'd you think? Did you have fun? Did that feel good? And at first they would be a little bit taken aback, but then I could see that they would get like excited to have the conversation. And then because you're usually sort of gassing each other up in certain ways, and then they have an opportunity to say, oh no, I actually really like X, Y, and Z. And I can be like, oh, me too. I just didn't think that you would like that. And so that was always, beneficial. It doesn't only have to be reserved for someone you're with consistently. What happens like if you're somebody who you really want to talk about all of this and you bring it up to your partner, but then they sort of shut it down or they get a bit defensive. What does somebody do in that scenario?
This is where, like, any type of like, it's not conflict necessarily, but any type of conflict that comes in a relationship, you should pull those resources out. So use I statements. This is really important to me. I feel sexually confident to be able to talk to you about this, or I feel, more safe, which ultimately makes me more turned on. So it doesn't have to be like, I need to do this because I think that that's what I should do because of my sex educator. Like it can be like, this turns me on, or I feel more safe. And those are, if you're on the receiving end of that and you're still kind of doing some pushbacks, and there should be some like critical thinking about that relationship. But other things to keep in mind is that maybe they just really struggle with that communication piece. So that could be one option. And so again, meeting them in the middle in some way and say like, what are you comfortable talking about? Or like, what's stopping you from having this conversation? So being curious and not defensive. The other thing is if they're just resistant, they're like, no, I just want to jump into bed. Let's get naked and like, let's get started. Is there a boundary for you? Is that conversation important enough for you where you will not have sex with that person or you won't like move forward in that relationship? And of course, there's some in between gray areas, right? You can continue to kind of have that conversation more than once, trying to get them to understand your perspective. Or do you value this sexual experience and you feel safe enough to not have that beginning conversation? Again, I wouldn't recommend that, but it is on the person to kind of consider like, if this person is uncomfortable and maybe it's stigma or their cultural norms around sex, or that's not a value to them, am I okay that this is a mismatch? Am I willing, is this a priority to me? So it's ultimately their decision as long as the sex feels consensual during it, right? Hopefully they're getting consent in some form throughout the sexual experience, but it is like an add-on and a benefit to have this conversation beforehand. But I think someone should really consider, is this a deal breaker for me if someone can't have this conversation or not? Because I'm talking about like the best case scenario. It's where your partner is ready to talk about it, right? And that's not always the case. And there's definitely cultural and religious context to that. And I want to make sure those folks in those relationships understand that they can still have sexually satisfying experiences and consensual experiences, but it may not be at the highest level it could be.
So we've been talking about this all in the context of more consistent partners, but the reality is that is not the case for everyone. What do these conversations look like when you are sort of entering into a physically intimate space with somebody that you barely know? Does the conversation change at all? Let's say like you just met someone at a bar and you go home with them. What does it look like in that sort of context?
Yeah. So I would start with two things. One, it's going to be awkward, any kind of conversation, because you just don't know this person. You don't know how they're going to respond. Some people who maybe frequently hook up may feel more comfortable talking about sex, but it also could be the opposite. And then again, like, if you're like, I want to hook up with someone like at some point in the next year, just thinking about like, if I have an opportunity to hook up with someone, would I ever do it? Having that conversation with yourself of, is this a deal breaker if I can't have that conversation? So again, out of the context of tonight I'm bringing a guy home or whatever it may be, like knowing your boundary beforehand. But it might look different. I would say like minimally, which is where the basic sex education comes out, is you should be talking about barrier methods or contraceptives. I like to remind folks, even though this is like more basic knowledge, but you can get STIs even if you're on birth control, and you can still get STIs through oral sex. And so even if you think you're doing lower risk activities, again, think about your willingness to engage in that risky behavior. So barrier methods. So I know a lot of times it's just like, do you have a condom? Or I brought condoms, but it could be more. You could start there with that. Like, hey, I brought condoms, and like, what do you want to do? What's your favorite position? Right. And so like, what do you want to try with me? So then hopefully that can open it up. I think even from like the condom question, you'll know kind of like if they're even willing to talk about it. Again, I talk to a lot of my college students about, well, what happens if my partner is not willing to wear a condom? And I'm like, well, is that a boundary for you? Like, are you willing? In the hookup situation, again, are you willing to ask them about their STI status? And no, they could lie, or they could not be aware that asymptomatic STIs exist. And so Again, I'm not gonna say, "Don't do it, don't do sex," but there could be consequences, and so you can be informed enough to make that decision of, "Do I want to maybe possibly get pregnant during this?" Or, "I may get an STI from this." Same thing with pleasures. I may not have the best sex in my life tonight because this person doesn't wanna talk to me about it. And are you okay with that? Or do you feel like that would, reduce your experience and you don't wanna experience something that way? But I think it could just, again, be a little bit more casual and think about, "Hey, like, it really turns me on to, like, talk a little bit about what we're gonna do," and just frame it that way, even if it doesn't turn you on. You kinda break the ice in some form if it's important to you, that safety-wise. So that's what I would consider, but really knowing your boundaries about how they will respond and also being able to navigate the awkwardness. If you feel like you can't navigate it, are you okay even bringing up the questions, And so and that may be no, and there's nothing wrong with that person for not having that comfort level as long as they feel they're okay with that experience and it's a consensual experience in some form. Again, it just may be a little bit riskier, maybe not as pleasurable or a little even awkward physically, because we know hookups
Mhm.
typically aren't the most
Are awkward.
pleasurable experiences, as much as, like, someone who knows your body in some form.
It sounds like knowing your line before you go into these experiences, which we talk about this with fraternity men, but more about knowing your line from like a moral standpoint. But in these scenarios, like know your line before you get into that situation. And so you can go in more prepared. Additionally, like something that I thought about with starting this conversation, like that icebreaker. I think a good one is like, how would you feel if I borrowed one of your t-shirts or if it depending on, who you're with or whatever. How would you feel if I slept in my underwear? If that seems like more the vibe if you're sleeping over, I guess it's been a long time since I've been in the hookup game. So maybe that's maybe that's not even maybe people hear that and are like, I would never ask to borrow anyone's t-shirt if I went home with them as a hookup. That's embarrassing. Maybe nobody does that. But yes, knowing your line before you get into these scenarios. When you and I initially had our first conversation, you mentioned something that surprised me a little bit and also something that I just simply didn't know. A lot of these communication frameworks that you've been mentioning, actually, you said they come from the kink and or BDSM community. And I know that when people hear that, they might think 50 shades of gray, that might be what they're picturing. Is that the place where these frameworks are coming from or is that not an accurate picture of where these frameworks stem from?
So 50 Shades of Grey within the BDSM community is well known to be like misrepresenting of that community. I think even before the book and the movie came out, right? A lot of people probably have some misconceptions around the BDSM kink community. And so I do want to point out one that there is a range of behaviors and what people are willing to do within that community. So not everyone is going to the extreme that you may think of, or may have heard of. And there are folks that do that as well, but most folks that are good members in this community are using some type of consensual framework. I will give the caveat that, like, this community is not one that I educate, but I do try to learn from them myself, again, to pull into these conversations. And so if you typed in BDSM consent framework, you will find a ton of different frameworks. But the ones that I'll point out today, but you can do your own research in, is the 4 Cs, RAC, which is an acronym, prick, SSC, and those are different ways to consider consent and risk awareness. So a lot of times when people are engaging in like sexual activity in the BDSM community, they're doing some type of scene. So in 50 Shades, you see that contract, which could be like somewhat a representation, but I wouldn't say necessarily exactly like that in that intensity. I actually rewatched that section like a couple weeks ago, and I was like, this is intense and like definitely not how this works. But the idea that you and your partner or partners are talking about what you're going to do before engaging in sexual acts together, and like line by line, this is what you all are going to do. So, of course, a lot of times people are aware of like the submissive person and the dominant person, and this helps, keep the safety of the submissive. And also like the dominant person will also have some boundaries and understand like what they're willing to do. And so that is some representation, but in 50 Shades of Grey, there's a lot of consent, there's no consent, and silence is consent. within the main female character, or that fear of like losing the relationship. And so not sharing with her partner that she doesn't want to actually try this thing. And that is not how BDSM is and or should be how any kind of sexual relationship is. And so I would say if 50 Shades of Grey made you interested in BDSM, dig a little bit deeper and you'll probably find that like it's actually a lot safer and a lot more open communication than what 50 Shades of Grey is doing. So it's totally okay people read that and are like, I'm kind of into this. That's fine. You're curious. It did bring to light some different sexual behaviors. It's just not shown in a consensual way always and can create a lot of stigma. And so with these consensual frameworks, like the OG framework is called SSC. So that's safe, sane, consensual. We don't use this anymore because sane is kind of ableist and not necessarily the best way of describing it. But the concept of, what we're going to do has the context of safety. There's going to be consent all the way. And then sane is like that clarity of mind. I would say like the more updated version of that is RAC or the 4C. So RAC is risk aware consensual kink. So the idea that the partners or the folks involved in the sexual act are aware of the risks. And again, in context of like maybe people not in this community, anal sex is kind of risky in general, right? Like if you're not using enough lube, you could create micro tears in the anal canal and that could result in infection. And that's not necessarily BDSM, but that's some risk. So if you're trying something new, you're biting your partner's nipples, the person receiving that, like your nipples may bleed if you like allow them to keep on biting and biting because it feels good. And that should be awareness that the consequence that may be an outcome of this activity. Obviously, in context of BDSM, they're thinking more about receiving pain or inflicting pain on one another. And so that is something to keep in mind and having that conversation. Hey, like whatever feels risky to you or whatever you think could have a negative outcome, talking about it, that could be part of the conversation. And it doesn't have to be beforehand, but saying like as you prep for anal sex, and I always use that because I think people don't know how to do anal sex correctly. But like
I don't
talking
I
about like,
yeah, I don't know how
right?
to do that.
Yeah.
Um, full transparency, not that everybody needed to know that. Surprise, now everybody knows. Shannon
Yeah.
doesn't do anal.
That's okay. I mean, you don't know how to do it. That's, you can
How
learn
was
right
I
now.
supposed to know? Nobody
Yeah.
told me. I'm
Yeah. I
grateful
only
for the
learned.
resources at my fingertips for if one day I choose to go down that hole. Just
Yes.
not quite there yet. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, that's totally fine. That's totally fine. And I honestly learned like about the safety protocol of it through my sex therapy class. Like there's like a handout I got which would like walk you through how to work up to a penis or a sex toy in the anus. I was like, wow, like you don't just put the penis in there? Like
What? I never yeah, who would have thought? And I think have you ever heard it's the song that goes like, "An anal is sex that God can't see," or whatever? And it
no.
oh my gosh. Okay. I'll have to send it to you after this, but it's basically this whole thing that's like, it's like these girls that are like, "Oh, we're saving ourselves for marriage," but it's
Mm,
like, well, obviously men can't help themselves, and so we have to
mm.
come up with some other way to pleasure them, and so anal is the sex that God can't see. But how terrifying because like anal sex has like a lot of higher risk factors like you were just saying, and gosh, I hope that that's not what people are doing from an uneducated standpoint. Like, I hope that they're safe. That was total tangent.
No, no, you're right though. You're right. And I would say like that's a great example of one, to educate yourself before engaging in anal sex. It's really easy to find. I would say like Scarletine would be a good like I don't know if anyone has heard of that, but it's a blog where basically you could Google like any kind of sex question and they typically have it. I know it says it has teen in the name, but it's likely for anyone. But point being is there's a lot of step-by-step guides. And one of the things is knowing that like silicone-based lube is typically preferred because it lasts longer during anal sex and there is not that natural lubrication. And so, one, if you only have water-based lubricant, the risk-aware conversation there could be like, I only have water-based. Are you okay with this? Like there's that risk that, I might not stop in time to put more lube on the penis or sex toy, and that could result in that tear. And so that could be in the middle of sex before. So point being is like the BDSM kink community often are sometimes the most safest folks engaging in sex because communication is so, so important in these behaviors that could harm them or risk their health in some way. And again, that consent is always there for that safety piece. And so people don't have to implement it step by step, but just know that, like, look into BDSM consent. If you want to increase your skills around consent or think about the different parts of consent, that's just not like, do you want to do this? Yes or no?
It's not like the movies, and there's a lot more behind the scenes that are actually
Yep.
happening. Speaking of communication, obviously, most of this podcast has been focusing specifically on pleasure, but I do know that a lot of my listeners are people who've experienced sexual assault or trauma, and I get emails and messages from them. And one of the most common ones that I receive is, how do I even begin to start reconnecting with pleasure when my body has this like whole other negative history around sexual experiences? So what are some things that you would say to people who have had these experiences and want to get back to experiencing pleasure?
Yeah. And this is like something that I have done a lot of research on because I think it's really interesting, right? Because it's not just like I have this barrier of culture or religion or, shame, but like my body does not feel safe to engage in this, or like, I'm worried about being triggered or activated in some form. And so the first thing to say is, like, anyone going through this and having to navigate a sexual life afterwards, like, it's really hard. And it's not going to be a straight line, just as I'm sure, like, Shannon has talked about many, many times in other episodes. Just knowing this is going to be one of the harder things probably you're going to have to experience. And that's really unfortunate, right? Because pleasure can give us so much and can be a healing power when it comes to trauma or any kind of chronic pain, etc. And so I will say, of course, this recommendation is probably not shocking to anyone, but I do think if you have the access and means to go to therapy, I think trauma processing is a really big part. And I know I've repeated myself a few times, but regulating your nervous system in order to have pleasurable sex will make it easier for you to get through maybe those mental barriers of like the sexual trauma part, because we can work through the body and we can work through the mind, and some of that's together. But if you're only doing stuff, coping mechanisms mentally, your body may still be in that, freeze or flight instinct. And so if you have the means, absolutely do that. And again, some of that could just be focusing on the trauma itself or talking with like a sex therapist about, like, how do I overcome this barrier? So knowing that those could be two different things. It could be with the same therapist, it could be with a different therapist depending on their expertise. If you don't have the means, which most folks don't, finding some coping mechanisms to process the trauma. And so again, thinking about the mental part and the physical part. So the mental part, how can you process that experience? If you do like to verbalize it and talk about it, then is journaling a good thing? Are you able to kind of read aloud the things that you wrote down so you can mimic that cognitive behavioral therapy? If you don't want to talk about it, or, again, like, you don't remember it and it's just more in the physical body, leaning into the physical techniques you can do. So grounding, of course, the mindfulness and meditation. I know that in this community, we talk a lot about yoga, and yoga can be a really strength for processing trauma. It also can be really hard because a lot of times it's in a public space, right? So you could be, like, oh, yoga is a good way to release a lot of trauma. But if you're in a class of 20 other folks and all of a sudden you're starting to cry or your legs start to shake, you may not want that experience. And so kind of figuring out, how can you explore yoga maybe on your own, or, finding a trauma informed class. I'm a yoga instructor, so this is kind of where I'm going, but
Got it.
but like, there are structures in place where a trauma informed class would look very, very different than just any kind of regular class, or looking for someone who is a trauma informed yoga instructor, even if it's not specific class around trauma. I think like the majority of folks get some kind of like trauma sensitivity training in their yoga certification, but there's folks who are like only work with sexual violence survivors, or like all their classes, regardless of the community, is going to be trauma informed, which is what I do. And that involves like not like getting off the mat and walking around, not like physically helping that person get into those positions, that can be, of course, triggering. And then certain positions can release trauma, but like being ready and prepared if someone is activated by that or if they are seeing that emotional or physical response in some form. I would think that's really good. I think also just starting to touch yourself again in a way that's non sexual so that your body gets used to that feeling of touch. A lot of people, again, just don't have good relationships with their body anymore because it reminds them of the experience. And so, what can you do to create that relationship? Ultimately, I do think like therapy is the most helpful to really get that processing of your body in particular. When it comes to like working to your way up to sex, I would say, like, again, start with that sensate focus, even if it's just by yourself and that touch, get used to the touch. Notice the pleasure, right? Massaging your own feet or using a massage gun. I always use that on my feet, but on any part of your body and like allowing yourself to feel the pleasure is one step there. And then, of course, ease your way into masturbation. Even if you never masturbated before, it is the safest way for you to start to experience that sexual pleasure. So even if you feel like, oh, I suck at this, or this isn't really my jam, outside of the context of like I never did this, trying to touch your vulva, your breast, your penis, your butt in whatever way to kind of reconnect with it. And then you'll start to notice maybe again what doesn't feel good or what brings up that stress response, that trauma response, and you can be more informed. So I would always recommend trying that at least once, but definitely a lot more if possible. And then communicating with your partner. So I would never say, again, this is where like things may change, but if someone's really timid and fearful of having sex, which isn't again always the case for folks who are survivors, but to do with someone safe, whether they aren't in a committed relationship, but they have a friends with benefits that they can talk to that person about this experience, or they are again have a consistent partner, engaging with body mapping, engaging with sensate focus before ever doing sex. And then when having sex, really consider like what are you like comfortable doing right now? Are you most comfortable trying oral sex right now? Or is it just kissing with the breast and working your way up and knowing that you might really like oral sex and you've been doing that for a couple months and then you try penetrative sex or use sex toys and all of a sudden you're right back to the starting line. And that's just knowing your body and stopping. And so when you feel that pain, you need to stop because otherwise your nervous system again will be like, you don't like me, you're not listening to me, and this could re-traumatize you to some form or put you right back to where you started. And so that is really important in taking it slow and letting your partner know, hey, I know it's can be like in your head, right? Like, oh, I wanna fulfill my partner's needs too. But having that open communication where you're at, and hopefully your partner, right, is willing and able to be okay with that situation. Or otherwise, that partner may not be so good, or their needs aren't being met, and that relationship is not a match. So, again, communication is really important, so you can fully trust that partner. And then on that partner's end, of course, just like knowing that you're not doing anything wrong if they, get triggered during it or if they have a bad reaction or they have that like postcoital blues and they cry afterwards. This is their nervous system telling them something. And as long as like they are talking through this, it's consensual. Like it can be really hard mentally on the partner as well. But just knowing that you being supportive and showing up in that space and stopping and trying different things is all we really need to be doing as a partner.
It sounds like so there's the line for yourself as well as a survivor, and then the continued communication, and, like, being patient and understanding that it's not just a linear journey back to experiencing pleasure. It can kind of be 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, that sort of a thing. But what I'm also hearing is that pleasure is possible to experience again. I really remember after my assault thinking, I refuse to let this person ruin the most intimate thing that you can do with like another person. Like I refuse to let this person ruin my sex life and just wanting to like barrel right back into everything. And as you've mentioned, for some people that's the right thing and for others it's not. But the overarching idea that you can experience pleasure again and feel wonderful and have really incredible experiences with someone else, and that it's not just, oh, you're cooked forever. Sorry. Like this person did that and now you're never ever going to get to experience again. Like there is light at the end of the tunnels is what it sounds like.
Yes, the majority of folks that experience sexual violence do engage in pleasurable sex at some point once they're able to kind of work through those things. Absolutely. And it's something to remind folks or remind yourself about because it may feel like you're there forever, just like any type of like post trauma experience, right? You feel like you're going to be in this mental state or physical state forever. And it's not the case, but you may be there for a while.
I have one final question for you, Molly, and this is switching gears a little bit. I think a lot of us have things about our sex lives that we need to fix or we need to change, and we kind of hyper focus on them. And one of the things that came to mind that might not actually need to be changed at all is the number of times you have sex or you're physically intimate with someone. Is there a set number of times? Does that not matter at all? Is that a thing?
Yeah, yeah. As we've talked about, media definitely informs kind of what our expectations are around sex. And that can definitely make you feel like you should be having sex X amount of times per week or per month or per year, wherever you are in that. I will say that, engaging in sex is great for your health and well being. Like, again, we know that some folks experiencing chronic pain can see some relief of symptoms through sex. And so, like, there is, sex can be really good to have on occasion for health benefits. We're increasing our hormones in our body, our positive hormones. And so we really want to make sure that that could be an asset to whatever else you want in life, but it should really be personal. When you're thinking about sex, I think when you're asking yourself this question of like, how often do I want to have sex? You pause and think about what do I know about what I consumed in the media or from my friends or from the online community? What do I know or what have I heard about this already? Because it can be really hard to be like, well, how often do I want to have sex? And like you might be like, yeah, on like a weekly basis or, 3 times a week. But is that because you heard it from someone? So kind of think about that question first,
I'm
right?
definitely guilty on that front. Like, oh, well, it should be 3. I feel like I heard that sometime. Successful marriages have sex 3 times a week or something,
Yeah.
but
And
maybe
there's
that's not
there's
what I
definitely
feel.
some research around the number of times you have sex and like benefit, but like I think what's important in relationships is that intimacy piece. Again, we have folks that don't engage in sex at all. And they have great, pleasurable, satisfying lives in other ways. And so it's not prescribed in some form. We do see research on the health benefits or like there could be a positive impact on your relationship. And if you and your partner or partners are totally okay with the number of times you're having per week, or you want to reduce it or increase it, but you both feel good with that, that's totally fine. Again, if you're like, hey, I want to increase the health benefits, then again, talk to your partner. And that's also a okay reason. Like, I want to have sex more because it helps me with my stress. And as long as your partner is also okay with having sex more, that's okay. Really kind of considering what feels good to you. Is that in line with your partner? And of course, there's sometimes, right, where you're having those conversations of like your partner wants to have sex more, maybe you don't. And that's where you can get into that context piece of like, is there these brakes and accelerators that are contributing to this conversation? Or do, like, like I'm so stressed, or like I have the, mental burden of the household, and that's why I don't want to have sex? Or is it just like, no, I like, I like to masturbate or I like to cuddle. And so you'll have to have that hard conversation with folks, but also it can be whatever number you want, and that's totally okay, and that's totally normal. So really just kind of reflecting on what were the expectations for yourself before answering this question, so you can know if you're being biased to yourself in some form.
And then I get to the thought of, oh my gosh, what do I actually know at
Yeah,
all? Is everything
yeah.
that I think about all this informed by outside pieces? A lot of it is. And like trying to crack down the layers to the core of what I need and want and vice versa for my partner.
And you could try and be like, okay, maybe I do want to have sex 3 times a week. And then you strive for that. And then, you may come up against the sexual response part and work through that or see why that's happening. And you may find an answer through that. Like, actually, yeah, this really helped elevate my mood all week. I really like this. Or like, honestly, I didn't see a difference between having sex twice a week versus 3 times a week. My partner felt the same. Or we felt burnt out trying to have sex the third time that week or the fourth time. And so you can explore and I think scheduling sex is also totally okay okay, I know people a lot of times are like, "I can't believe I have to schedule sex with my partner." But it can help with, like, that mental turn on piece as well, and so, like, you could say, "Let's schedule 3 times a week and, try it for a couple weeks." If you hate it, then you find that out and you can adjust.
Well, Molly, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with me and for my audience today. Thank you for being here. Thank you to everyone for listening and tuning into today's episode. If you guys want to take a look at any of the resources that Molly mentioned, the pleasure profile, the sensate focus, she sent a link to me for that. All of that will be linked down below in the show notes. So take some time, figure that out, explore for yourself, explore with your partner, explore with your friends. Honestly, have like a night with your pals and get a bottle of wine or your favorite beverage and like project it on the TV and talk about it. I don't know. I feel like that could be kind of fun. If you guys want to reach out to Molly, if you have questions or want any additional resources, her email will also be linked down below. Remember, she does have a job. Like, you guys aren't her number one. So be patient when you send her an email. She might take a little bit to respond, but she has offered her email to be able to answer questions or give you additional resources if you want that. If you guys want to send any message to What They Don't Say, if you're interested in some Consent is Hot merch, go to whattheydon'tsay.com. I love you guys. I'll catch you on the flip side, and cheers.
Cheers.